Let me show you something. This is a 2-hour-long academic debate about the utility of religion. It has over 6 million views. In fact, they did a lot of these debates, and I've watched them all, twice. I also watched this 18-hour-long lecture series about the first book of the Old Testament, this 17-hour series about the second book, and 14 hours into this series about the Jesus book, and 26 hours into this series about the meaning crisis. In 2024, I read 1,500 pages of Dostoevsky talking about why Christianity is awesome, and these books about why Christianity sucks. I read these books about pagan religion, and this book about why we don't need religion at all. And in a plot twist that Dostoevsky himself couldn't have written, I even picked up the Bible. I'm confused. The result is that I'm fairly certain that without religion, we are kinda fucking cooked. I'm going to explain what the fuck that means and how I came to that conclusion as an agnostic atheist, and try to condense everything that I've learned into this one video. First, I'll explain why I now believe that many of the worst aspects of your life are probably happening because you don't believe in God. And then I'll explain why the solution to that problem isn't to start believing in God. And if you do believe in God, then don't watch this video because it won't help you at all. Got it? Alright, strap in because this is about to get me cancelled.
Nietzsche said that words like cat, dog, they're often short words, which is of course genius. And I thought, Jesus, that's probably true. And so he's very insightful.
Quick glossary. For the rest of this video, when I say God, I'm not talking about a generic higher power. I'm talking about God as represented in the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, I grew up as a staunch atheist in a Christian primary school, and the Christians in charge of that school did not do a very good job at representing the religion. All the students were terrified to state that we didn't believe in God, because if one of the teachers heard us, then we would be punished. Turns out that's not a very great method of persuasion.
We had a Christmas night, and it wasn't Christmas songs, it was like Praise the Lord songs.
At the time, I thought Christianity was a bunch of dumb stories about a man in the sky written for a bunch of dumb old people who were too stupid to use iPads. And yet here I am, at 22 years of age, convinced that religion is deeply useful and making a gigantic video essay about it. So what changed? Well, at some point in my teens, I realised that the religious opinions I generated when I was 8 years old likely weren't as clever as I thought they were at the time, and that those old people who couldn't use iPads probably weren't quite so dumb either. So I decided to take another look. I soon realised that calling religious people dumb was cringe, disrespectful, and just simply not true, especially considering how many geniuses across history have been very religious. But I still couldn't understand why. Then when I was 19, I heard this cognitive scientist called John Vervaeke talking about the different types of belief.
Okay, here's an object. How close should I be to it?
And it was the first time that the distinction between propositional belief and enacted belief was ever brought to my attention. This was a big deal. So what is this difference? Well, for example, take the sentence, exercise is worth the effort. That is a proposition. If you believe that proposition, then you have a propositional belief in it. But if you don't actually exercise, then you don't have an enacted belief in that same truth. My headmistress in primary school often proposed that the creator of the universe was always watching, and didn't want us to lie. But then she falsified student reporting data for years to make herself seem more competent than she was. Point being, we state our belief in things that we don't truly believe all the time. And it's not always because we're lying. Oftentimes it's simply because the part of our brain that has propositional beliefs is entirely different from the part that drives behaviour. And my turning point with respect to religion was when I realised that the opposite is also true. We often enact beliefs that we wouldn't verbally agree with. For example, I was a nihilistic teenager who couldn't stop talking about the idea that nothing really matters. And then some asshole came along and pointed out that I was acting as if the idea that nothing matters mattered. Other examples include avoiding planes even though you intellectually believe they are safe, atheists who wouldn't swear in a church even if they knew nobody was around, and people who wear their lucky tie to important meetings even though they intellectually believe that it won't have an effect. So, considering that we can believe things on the level of behaviour that we don't believe intellectually, what would happen if, instead of intellectually agreeing with the propositions of the Bible, everyone enacted the Bible instead? Participated in the story? Well, in that case, the Bible wouldn't really be a book anymore, would it? It wouldn't be a repository of propositions about history. It would be a tool that synchronizes behavioral patterns throughout gigantic societies of otherwise out of sync talking monkeys. It would essentially be a psychological operating system. And I'm not making the case that if a modern society participated in the Bible, then they would, for certain, do better than if they hadn't. Dogma is a real risk, and I am far too stupid to be able to make that prediction. That being said, it's not that hard to see why the biblical society might do better than its more chaotic alternative, even if that's just by virtue of everyone being on the same page, pun intended. Now, granted, if everybody was on the same page, and that page said, steal shit from your homeboys, that society's probably gonna do worse. So let's steelman the case for, say, Christianity for a moment, and assume that the page says something like, love thy neighbour as thyself, and other useful things such that it makes people predictably better rather than worse. Assuming that that is the case, does it make the Bible any more true? Of course, the knee-jerk reaction is just to be like, fucking nah mate, it just makes it more useful. But how do we actually distinguish between what's useful and what's true? Take your beloved science, for example. Scientific theories are considered true insofar as they are reliable predictors of reality. That's literally how we prove that the theories are true, by demonstrating that they predict events, that they predict phenomena. Newton's laws of motion are considered to be true and are still used by mechanics all across the globe today, even though Einstein's relativity proved that they are not the truth 100 years ago. Still, on Earth, we use Newton's laws, not Einstein's, because they're more useful. And usefulness is the hallmark of alignment with reality. And alignment with reality is as good a definition of truth as you're going to get. The representation of my lovely and handsome face that you're seeing on your screen right now is as true at 1080p as it would be at 4K. One is just a lower resolution version of the same truth. But I don't upload these videos in 8K because people aren't looking for the highest resolution representation of my face that they can find. If they were, then I'd be slightly confused and please stop watching my videos. They're just looking for a representation of my face that is both true and high resolution enough. And the same applies to people's internal representations of reality. We want them to be both true and high resolution enough. So while Newton's lower resolution truths may not be the truth, they are nonetheless true. And since we are limited creatures, it seems that we ought to be more concerned with objective truth than we are with the objective truth. So if Newton's laws of motion are considered true because of their utility, despite Einstein proving that they are not the truth, then can we consider the Bible to be true because of its utility, despite science proving that it's not the truth? Kind of, but you can feel that the theory's incomplete, right? So let's take it a step further. Since propositional belief and enacted belief imply the existence of propositional truth and enacted truth, it might make sense to consider the Bible as true within the bucket of enacted truth, a bucket that is, by definition, incomprehensible. So to explain what the fuck enacted truth actually is, and why it's incomprehensible, I first have to explain where it comes from. Why the Bible? Why the Jewish Torah or the Hindu Vedas? What makes these stories so special? Why Abraham and the Israelites when we have Spider-Man and the Avengers? Think of it this way. Humans became capable of language roughly 50 to 200,000 years ago. But we only became capable of writing about 3,000 years ago. With that in mind, let's imagine a conversation that might have taken place shortly after humans developed language. Ben went looking for berries, tried to cross the North River, then an alligator ate Ben. This is a story, and the moral of this story is do not cross the North River or an alligator will eat your balls. So then, one of the functions of humans is to watch how other humans act, take note of what happens to them, and then tell stories about it so that we don't keep making the same mistakes. But before the written word, these stories had to be passed down orally to new generations. And anybody who's ever played Chinese Whispers will be able to see how Ben's story might eventually evolve into something like, Death dwells at the North River, quietly whispering hither, hither. See, now that it rhymes, it's far more memorable. It's also more spooky, so kids will listen. And while people might try their luck with an alligator, nobody's going to try their luck with death itself. So the story is more effective. And now that death is personified, the story can actually evolve further. For example, say a greedy knobhead named Jeff eats the entire tribe's food supply, and then everybody kills him.
My name is Jeff.
Jeff's story could evolve into, at the North River, death does stay, but on full stomachs, death does prey. He comes at night, eyes glow green, and says to the greedy, come with me. This story also rhymes, includes the morals of both Ben's story and Jeff's story, and if people enact their belief in it, then nobody goes in the North River or steals anyone else's food. But wait, unintended consequence alert, the story said that death preys on full stomachs, not thieves. So now nobody is overeating at all, which means they're also not overhunting their prey, which means there will be more prey available to hunt in the winter. Therefore, the tribe is more likely to survive, and so is the story. And you can debate my particular example as much as you want, but here's the key point. If that tribe is religious about that story, then they don't need to know about the dangers of overhunting, because their belief in the story is making them act as if they already knew. It follows that religious stories don't contain the most truth, as a passive reading of Peterson might suggest. It's that they account for the most truth. And since the stories live in the human mind, that includes truths about the human mind just as much as truths about the world. Another sidebar, I'm pretty sure AIs like ChatGPT work like this too. They don't know or store their training data, they account for it. Side note, I just asked ChatGPT if this is accurate, and it said yes. It accounts for the truth in a similar way. Anyway, simply telling Greedy Jeff's story wouldn't prevent theft, because it's only a matter of time until some asshole comes along and decides that Jeff didn't go wrong by stealing, he went wrong by getting caught. And since humans are stupid and we don't know what we don't know, we're bound to overestimate our ability to get away with things. The story about death preying on full stomachs accounts for this truth in a way that Jeff's raw story doesn't. In summary, reality is incredibly complex, and we can't figure out the best way to act simply by analysing the facts that we have. And this really does get to the core of this whole theory, just as the tribe couldn't see the dangers of overhunting, there are dangers that you can't see either. And in the same way that the tribe's story made them act as if they could see that danger, the religious stories that survive today will make you act as if you can see the dangers that you can't. Or at least they would if you believed them. So just as arbitrary genetic mutations cause species to evolve by natural selection, arbitrary story mutations cause cautionary tales to evolve in a similar way. And what are religious stories if not humanity's greatest cautionary tales? But here's the important point. It's not the most accurate stories that survive the longest, nor is it the stories that contain the most information. It's the stories that account for the most truth. Therefore, they have to be optimally adapted, not just to the structure of our minds and memories so that they have an impact, or the blind spots in our understanding of reality so that the impact that they have is good, but to the dynamic relationship between the two. The degree to which a story accounts for that relationship is the degree to which it has enacted truth. There we go, that was the enacted truth explanation. Oh my god, that was like 7 minutes or something. I'm sorry. Therefore, Enacted truth either fills in your blind spots or causes you to avoid them. My theory is that the function of God and heaven is to fill them in so that you do the things you're too blind to see the value in doing, and the function of the devil and hell is to cause you to avoid the dangers that you're too blind to see or take seriously enough. That is how the stories, and the people who live by them, survive. Our longest surviving stories are religious texts, and just as gravitational pressure makes diamonds, these stories have been subjected to more cultural pressure than any other products of human language. So yes, some rich fuckers have voted in some diabolical passages, but the core stories account for immense degrees of truth. It follows that to disregard the Bible as propositionally false is to disregard the river story by saying, death doesn't really have green glowing eyes, so you know what, fuck that story, I'm gonna go take a swim in the North River. You're not exactly a genius, you're just gonna go for a very unenjoyable swim. But it's not exactly your fault. Hear me out. If stories are engaged in the sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest dynamic that I just described, then they evolve to fit their environment. In survival of the fittest, fittest doesn't mean strongest or most powerful, it literally means most well adapted to its environment. So just as a very powerful animal will go extinct if its environment changes faster than it can, so too will a story go extinct for the same reason. Which raises the question, in which environment do stories live? They live in our heads, in our mental models of reality, in which propositional beliefs play a very important role. And it must be said that the mental model of a 21st century TikTok zoomer who runs around in a wizard costume is altogether different from that of a human only 10 generations ago. Because of science, our mental models of reality have changed faster than the stories for the first time in human history. When a tribesman 20,000 years ago heard that death has green glowing eyes, that little bit of information didn't contradict any existing part of his mental model of reality. And if everyone else believed it, then his guess was as good as any. So the story containing that proposition would be well fitted. But in the past few hundred years, the human mind has been flooded with the discoveries of science, which means that the story of Adam and Eve, powerful as it may be, is no longer well fitted to its environment, because everyone already has a story in their head of how humans came to be. Evolution. So while the story used to account for the fact that we had no idea where we came from, it's now accounting for something that's not true, so it's dying. It's like a bright white polar bear after the snow melts. What once made it blend in now makes it stand out, and so while it hasn't become any less strong, it's now far less capable of surviving. But we still have lots of big and unanswered questions. So the question then becomes, can we extract the truths from these stories and continue to benefit from all of the work that millions of our ancestors did to preserve and maintain them? Yeah, I don't think so, because it was enacted truth, right? And to extract any truth from it, you would first have to reduce it to a proposition, and then you run into the problem of having an almost infinite selection of plausible interpretations of the text. Stories cannot be understood, nor can they exist in isolation. They require a host. They are like liquid. They take the shape of the vessel that they occupy. And you can alter the chemical composition of that liquid as much as you want by changing the stories, but you can't stop it from taking its vessel's shape. And it was Heraclitus who said, "No man steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." Anyone who's rewatched one of their favourite childhood movies knows this. You're different now, so the story is too. And the same with films that have plot twists. It's a different story the second time you watch it. In a whole different model, it's a whole different story. And religious stories were adapted to assume that their practitioners believed their propositions. For example, the Christian philosopher Kierkegaard said that the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. But here's the difference. A medieval peasant didn't pray because he believed it was a useful practice. He prayed because God commanded him to do so. Therefore, you can imagine that his nature would be changed a lot more. The qualities, the dynamic of a prayer when performed by somebody who believes those propositions is so different from that of someone who doesn't, that to call both practices by the same name of prayer is just a straight up mistake. Both may be useful, but they're doing something entirely different. It only looks similar on the outside. And the same applies to reading the Bible. When I read the Bible, I'm doing something entirely different to what my great-great-great-great-great-granddad was doing. I'm sifting for gold while he was drowning in it. The only way to truly act as if you believe those stories is to actually believe them. Otherwise, you'll just act like someone who's acting like they believe them. Without that belief, without that level of participation in the story that you're reading, the relationship between the story and your sense of self has an entirely different dynamic. So while the same stories are still here, for non-believers, they're essentially deactivated. They don't activate you in the way that they're supposed to. The propositional just no longer translates into the enacted. It really is like Nietzsche said, God is dead. But what if we continue to run into more and more of the hidden dangers that religion once protected us from? Might we still see an all-out revival of a propositional and enacted belief in religion? Can we revive God?
Is he dead? Do you think he's dead?
Okay, if this next section is going to benefit you at all, I first need to lay the ground rules, the assumptions, if you will, the axioms, if you're insufferable. Assumption number 1. A propositional belief is the conclusion of a process of thought. For example, process of thought. YouTubers want attention. Angelo is a YouTuber. Belief. Angelo wants attention. Assumption number 2. No process of thought could be punctuated by acts of will, voluntary switchings of attention, and retain its status as a continuous process of thought. For example, YouTubers want attention. I am a YouTube... Is that the time? Jesus. Assumption number 3. It will follow from this that a belief is not something subject to the will. It seems that I cannot present my own belief in something as an achievement, because by so presenting it, I would disqualify it as a belief. For example, no matter how hard you try and how fun it would be, your belief in Santa Claus just isn't coming back, even though he's real. So, with these assumptions in mind, should we attempt to revive God? I'll begin my answer with this quote. When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. Now that quote seems to suggest that all would be fixed if we simply chose to believe in God again. But if we're taking our 3 assumptions to be true, then if we did simply choose to believe in God again, then by virtue of it being a choice, it wouldn't really be a belief. So I disagree with its prescription, but its diagnosis seems to be accurate. Without religion, pseudo-religious ideologies that were invented by flawed individuals will replace the religious stories that evolved to have enacted truth. We're at a point in our evolution where we know just enough for the smartest of us to know that we know nothing at all, while the majority of us still think we've got it all figured out. And that poses huge dangers at the level of both the individual and the society. So I'll start with a summary of the societal dangers. For the first time in human history, we cannot answer the question, what are we doing here? Instead of having one unifying answer to that question, we have many possible answers that are just at war with each other. As a result, individuals are becoming more internally fragmented, and societies are becoming more tribally divided. In the gigantic, meaning-shaped hole left by the absence of those ancient belief systems, we've entered an era of viral idealism, a culture war, as they call it. A time where new ideas and narratives are engaged in, yet again, a Darwinian competition to dominate both the minds of individuals and the cultures of societies. Not by survival of those that account for the most truth, but survival of the most outrageous, or catchy. We have our trusty social media algorithms to thank for that. The result is that nobody can agree on anything. For every simple statement, there's a humanities expert to tell you why you're stupid and probably a Nazi. And for every human statement, there's a simpleton to tell you why you're a pussy and probably a communist. The only thing that we can collectively agree on is that everything is getting more expensive. And we can't even agree on why that's happening. Oh my god, I've been yapping for ages. In summary, ideologies are replacing religions, social status is our new god, and in their most Abrahamic jest, many people are already sacrificing their children to it. This French dude said that the fundamental question of philosophy is whether or not life is worth living. With that in mind, let's think about religion from an individual's perspective. Religion used to describe your life as just Act 1 in a larger cosmic narrative. And thus, even if your life contained more suffering than joy, it was possible to believe that it was still worth living, and living well. These days, we don't see our life as just one slice of a much bigger pie, we see it as the whole damn pie, and we're not at all convinced that it will contain or produce more joy than suffering. So we're not at all confident that it's worth living. In this sense, we have entered the self-destructive age. We see ourselves floating down the river of time toward the edge of a waterfall, and our highest aim is to have as much fun as possible before we fall to our deaths. Not the most compelling narrative. And it has some bad symptoms. I mean, all of a sudden, our enjoyment is now more important to us than our existence. The popularity of phrases like YOLO and I'm here for a good time, not a long time, are evidence enough of that. A more personal example is that when I was at my most nihilistic, I remember justifying my terrible behavior to my dad by saying, "What do you mean I have to get my shit together? I don't even have to exist." Which is a perfectly reasonable argument to make in the absence of religion. And so I enacted that belief. I ran around doing drugs and partying and sacrificing my future, enjoying my ride down the river before my time was up. And surprise, surprise, my mental health fell off a cliff. All my relationships deteriorated, everything that I valued about life became more distant, I nearly ended up in jail, and life felt even more pointless than it did before. And that's not to mention how much harder it had become. It's almost as if I walked headfirst into one of the hidden dangers that the religious stories would have protected me against. Myself. And as soon as I realized that, the sky just opened up and Jesus descended Jacob's ladder and filled my penitent heart with grace and made me a believer. Except that's not really how belief works, is it? So that didn't happen. I cannot believe something to be true simply because I believe that such a belief would be beneficial. The best I can do is pretend to believe. But that sort of dishonesty wouldn't be very Christian now, would it? The irony. So to summarize, I've consumed enough religious commentary to be featured on the next episode of My Strange Addiction, and since consuming all of that content, I have a sneaking suspicion that without religion, we are likely nothing more than just highly irrational to-do lists aimed at maximizing our social status. And yet I still can't read the Bible as if it was written by God. And I think that there are millions of young people in similar situations who feel spiritually homeless. So here we are, we have broken up with God, and as a culture we're slowly realizing that the single life is just a bag of dicks we aren't prepared to suck. And even assuming that the internet's favourite surrogate father does manage to convince everyone that Christianity would be good for them, that still won't make them Christians. Case in point, this guy. If I had a button that would make me believe in the Christian God, then I would 360 no-scope a pensioner just to reach it first. As a result, I definitely treat the Bible with far more respect than I would have 5 years ago. But respect isn't belief, and my stupid ass can't even understand it. So what are we to do? Us modern TikTok spawn with peas for brains? We want community, but church feels cringe. We want rituals, but who are we gonna pray to? Fucking Elon Musk? We want meaning, but we're convinced that the world is just a ball pit of atoms run by kiddie fiddlers. And we want to be good people, but I mean, really? In this economy? Oh, that reminds me, buy my Sigma entrepreneurship course. It's half price, only $15,000. That's a joke, I'm not selling anything yet, but I do have a free server, so if you're enjoying this video, then join the Compass. It's a free Discord community full of people like you. We do weekly accountability challenges like meditating and running and all sorts of fun stuff, so yeah, it's pretty cool, you should join. It seems like Gen Z atheists have to pick their poison, and it's either intellectually dishonest compot or nothing will ever matter carbonara. But what if, and this is the part where all of my sources go out of the window along with my pride, what if there was a third option? Being religious without a religion. Now, before you ask me whether or not I'm talking out of my ass, I am, but it's my ass and it's also God's honest truth, so listen up. I believe I am religious in general, but not in particular. A fair question to ask in response to this is, what the fuck does that mean, Angelo? That's just oxymoronic word salad. And to be fair, a few years ago I would have said the same thing, except in caps lock. But hear me out. I religiously engage with the world, but I don't subscribe to a religion. I mean, all throughout my teen years, I was an atheist nerd who couldn't meet a religious person without being like, well, actually. And if that had never changed, then I would probably still be a druggy bum, and my life wouldn't be as cool as it is now. So, and I do hate to do this, but fuck me, this is a long video. In the next video, I'm going to outline what it means to religiously engage with the world and try to explicate my philosophy for a living that saved me from something approximating a hellish existence. If you made it to the end of this video, congratulations, you might be just as weird as me, and I hope you found it useful. I will see you in part 2.